Welcome to Question Time. Tonight we are in Eastleigh. On tonight's panel, Paul Scully, a government business minister, also Minister for London and formerly Deputy Chairman of the Conservative Party. A Labour MP for more than 15 years, currently Shadow International Trade Secretary under Keir Starmer, Emily Thornberry. Caroline Lucas, former leader and co-leader of the Green Party and the party's only MP. Paul Polman, head of consumer goods giant Unilever for 10 years. Since 2019, a full-time campaigner tackling global inequality and helping businesses to become net positive. And historian, journalist, contributor to Radio 4's Thought for the Day, Daily Telegraph columnist Tim Stanley. Good evening. Welcome to my panel here in Eastleigh. Welcome to our audience who've come to see us. And, of course, welcome to Paul Polman, who is joining us down the line from Glasgow. Good to see you, Paul. And, of course, welcome to you at home for joining us. And do join in the conversation on social media in the usual way at BBC Question Time. OK, let's get started. Our first question tonight is from Anil Jain.
Has Tory sleaze returned?
Caroline Lucas.
Yes, Anil, Tory sleaze has returned on steroids, I'm afraid. I mean, it really has been pretty shocking to see the way in which OWEN PATERSON has been absolutely kind of defended by the Prime Minister, that, in a sense, we've effectively abolished any kind of independent system of dealing with MPs' misconduct, and instead we've got the prospect of a new committee that was going to basically be a bit of a kangaroo court. There was going to be a built-in government majority on the new committee. You can't just go around changing the rules when you don't like them, and that's exactly what this Prime Minister is doing. And it goes much wider, sadly, than just OWEN PATERSON. This is a Prime Minister who cares nothing for parliamentary standards or for decency or for the rule of law. And we've seen him do something similar when he simply prorogued Parliament, when he didn't like what Parliament was doing over Brexit. He refused to sack Priti Patel when she was accused of bullying. And he himself, of course, is the biggest problem of all. I have tried myself to find out how you hold the Prime Minister to account when he lies repeatedly. And let's be very clear, this is a Prime Minister who lies repeatedly and systematically. And the trouble is that the judge, the jury, the court is all the Prime Minister. There's no other way of holding him to account. So this is a bigger problem than just OWEN PATERSON. I'm very glad that he resigned. It was really quite grotesque to watch Parliament yesterday, to see the way in which all of these Tory MPs were kind of dragooned into supporting this amendment. And I'm not sure what Paul Scully will think of it, but I know, Paul, you did vote for it. And I think it's quite extraordinary to see how people can just be persuaded to vote for something that is so manifestly wrong. So, yes, Tory sleaze is back, and it's a very bad look.
Paul Scully.
No, it's not. We have a situation here where we have to look at the process, because I think actually if you look at the process that OWEN PATERSON went through, if that came to me as a constituency MP with someone in a different certain circumstances, when he was talking about the fact that it was 17 months, he had 17 witnesses, none of whom were questioned, then I would want to be able to test that. I would want to have maybe a second structure, an appeal system. We actually have two processes. We all have an independent complaints and grievance scheme that was set up with other issues around bullying, when the speaker was the previous speaker was accused of bullying, and other situations within the House. That actually has an appeal system. This one doesn't. So
is the government wrong to back down today, then?
Well, no, I think what I was going to say, that's why I voted about the process. And so I think it's fair that someone should be able to go through that. It did not overturn what the Commissioner for Standards actually found, because they would have had that due process, and then that would have come back, whatever the result was. But no, then obviously OWEN PATERSON has forced the issue by resigning, and I think clearly there was a case to answer. Absolutely, there was a case to answer.
Emily Thornberry.
There is an appeal process. Just let me just touch on that for a minute. So what happens is that if a complaint has been made against you, let's say you've received £500,000 from two companies to lobby for them, let's say, as happened with this case. He goes before an independent commissioner, he then can go before a panel of MPs and then can go before the whole of Parliament. It's just important to kind of stick to the truth. I mean, what happened 25 years ago, obviously, was that at the end of a long time of Tory government, Conservative MPs were taking money in brown envelopes in order to ask questions on behalf of companies. At the end of this long period of a Conservative government, we have Tory MPs taking money again in order to ask questions and to lobby on behalf. But at least last time, they were ashamed and introduced an independent way of dealing with it. I mean, listen, it's not just the Conservatives. There have been other MPs, clearly, who have brought Parliament into disrepute, and we need to have an independent system that can assess what has happened and make sure that proper decisions are made. We cannot have MPs deciding for themselves, and the current process that we have is one whereby more than half of the people on the panel are members of the public. And what happened yesterday was that the Conservatives decided to use their 80-seat majority and sweep away all of that to make a fundamental change to our constitution and decide that they were going to introduce a committee that was going to be dominated by Conservatives, that was going to be dominated by MPs, was not going to have any members of the public on, and was going to be chaired by a Conservative, so they could do whatever they wanted. Now, that isn't the way that we do things in this country. We need to have an independent panel, and we have to be very careful that quietly, once all the fuss is gone, that they don't try and introduce some skewed system that will allow them to do what they like, because they are not above the law. They are not above the law, and they should make sure that they stick to the rules like everyone else. You cannot, if you are found to have broken the rules, simply decide that you're going to change them. That is not the way that you behave in this country.
Okay. The woman right at the back with the glasses. The woman right at the back with the glasses.
I think actually it's a bit disingenuous to say that he didn't have the right of appeal. He was able to take his lawyers in to speak to the committee.
Exactly.
He had 17 written witnesses that he could take.
Written statements, you mean?
Written statements that he could take. But they were about character, and I read the report yesterday, they're about character references. And it's a bit like having more witnesses who will say, yes, he might be a burglar, but while he was burglaring your house, he fed the cat. He's a nice man, therefore it doesn't count. That's not true. I think the British public are fed up of Boris Johnson thinking he can get all his mates out of these things. In my mind, as a person looking at the news today, my reading, my narrative for this story is that Boris Johnson flew in a private jet down to London, went to a party, went to meet his friends. Amongst his friends were people there who persuaded him to get him off, to get Owen Paterson off. And he said, all right, I'll do it. This might not be the true narrative, but that's what the narrative is in the general public's mind. And I'm telling you, lots of people are saying that. My friends are saying that. We don't understand what happened yesterday. At one point, he was saying, we should do this. By lunchtime today, everything is thrown up in the air and everything is changed. What's the truth of it? Where are the facts in this?
You mentioned Boris Johnson flying down on a private jet to a dinner with some Telegraph columnists. Were you at that dinner, Tim?
This is very embarrassing. I was invited, but I couldn't get a dog sitter, so I didn't go. And as it's so typical
hang on, so the
of me,
Prime Minister went all the way from Glasgow.
This is why I'm a terrible journalist. I'm always 5 minutes away from where things are happening.
Very funny.
I always find a reason to not be in the room. And the government first backed Owen Paterson, then, by doing what it did, effectively withdrew support. And in so doing, it's damaged itself and it's damaged Owen Paterson. I think, actually, the Prime Minister was motivated by a sense of decency, which is that he thought that in this instance, a man was being unfairly hounded. Not just for the reasons that have been given because the process was so long and was so opaque and somewhat contradictory, not just because the lobbying that he's supposed to have done was raising genuine public health issues with ministers. One was related to dangerous quantities of antibiotics in milk, another was related to carcinogenic ham.
And he had to be paid for that.
In other words,
he had to be paid for that.
He was being paid while he passed this information on. But should he not have passed the information on? I'm just saying this is why.
In order to be a whistleblower.
But there is a third reason, which I'm surprised, which we perhaps not have mentioned because it's too sensitive, which is that last year Owen Paterson's wife took her own life, right? So that's why many Tory MPs privately felt morally obliged and sympathetic to support this man in this particular instance. Now, the problem is that they weren't just supporting a man with one case, which they might feel on the merits they can take his side on. They were also, in doing that, attempting to rewrite the rules. And that looks like someone's been found guilty of something and you're trying to get them off by rewriting the rules. And by screwing around in the last 48 hours, the government has ended up failing on both counts. It has undermined any case for reform because it looks like reform is a Trojan horse for getting their mate off.
Which it was.
But they've also done something which has led to an MP having to resign, even though he insists he is guilty of nothing. It's a PR disaster, but only a few weeks since the death of David Amess, a few weeks ago, we were talking about the importance of remembering that MPs are human beings. Doesn't mean they should be let off things when they've done wrong. Nonetheless, I'm just telling you that behind the scenes, there is a human context to this story, and that's why many Tory MPs felt obliged to support Owen Paterson.
Let's hear this. Lots of hands. There's the man in the check shirt.
I'm in human resources, and we have to deal with sort of issues like this all the time. But I find it very difficult where there's a standards piece and if someone's convicted in the court, both MPs, one gets hounded and has to leave, the other one can still be an MP. I find that very difficult to judge. So why don't we just have the same standard for everything? And if you're convicted of something, you have to leave as an MP, full stop.
And of course, Owen Paterson hasn't been convicted of anything.
No.
It's worth just reiterating that. Yes, a woman in the jacket there.
I think the MPs should only be dealing with their constituency issues and not taking on multiple roles. By taking on multiple roles, it's saying that the issues within their constituency is a part-time role.
Absolutely.
So I therefore have time to take payment from other companies.
Yeah.
When you're elected into this particular role for your constituency, you act for them and them alone and nobody else.
But I'm sorry, would you include things like being a firefighter or being a GP in that? Because I think it can be a good thing that MPs do something other than being an MP. It can give them experience that they can bring to their job.
I work about 70 or 80 hours a week, and I'm sure Emily does too, and maybe Paul. The idea that you're going to have time to be putting into doing another job on top of your work as an MP, I think is for the birds. I think where you might be right is that if we were to have... Can I just finish? Where you might be right is that we could look at something like job sharing for MPs. Now, that is something I think would be really positive. You get a much wider selection of people putting themselves forward for that role, people who are carers or people who want to keep a foot in the door of being a GP or a firefighter, whatever it is. But the idea that you can find time for a part-time job that's going to pay you 100,000 quid on top of being an MP, I just find quite preposterous.
Well, let me come to Paul Polman. We've got a little bit away from the question here. But, Paul, the question is, has Tory sleaze returned?
Yeah, I'm listening to this conversation with interest, and I am only privileged to what I read in the newspapers. But what is really clear to me is that it seems to be an own goal that has been scored here. At a time that we need more trust in our politicians, in any institutions, at a time that we need to operate under higher moral standards, I can only conclude that this is a human tragedy, but also a political tragedy that should have some lessons. You cannot change the game when you're playing the game, and that seems to be an attempt here to do that. That is very confusing for the public at large, and I consider myself to be part of that public at large. There is a bigger issue here, though, that has been raised, which I actually agree with, that to what extent do we let other money come into politics to influence the decisions that need to be taken. In my book, Net Positive, that just came out, I specifically discussed the $3.5 billion that industry is using to lobby at Congress in the US, in this case, to influence laws. And I have a problem with that. I think the society at large has a problem with that. At Unilever, I certainly would not allow any of these things to happen, if I may be very clear. So for individual companies to pay for very specific tasks to be done is something that I think might have been acceptable in the public eye a few years ago, but should be looked at now in the world that we live in currently. And my advice to companies would be, who actually pay that money, you're as much part of this problem that we're discussing as the people here that are being talked about. A trust comes on foot and leaves on horseback, and I think in this case the horses were out, and that's regrettable.
OK, well, thank you.
And it would be good to provide laws that are broader in this respect to cover this.
Man there in the purple sweater, yes.
I'd like to know when the government decided this process needed review.
Yes.
Is it because of Mr Patterson?
Yes.
Or is it because the process needs review? And either way, as the gentleman just said, once you've committed something under one set of rules, you shouldn't suddenly change them. Exactly. Change the rules by all means, but do that because you need to change them, not because one of your mates has got a problem.
Can I mean, I think there's been a sort of slow burn on this, because I think also you can see a pattern of behaviour in relation to this government, and particularly in relation to the Prime Minister, you know, who won't answer questions straightforwardly about how his flat at number 10 was redecorated, who paid for his holiday in Mystique, you know, and so on and so on. And then there are all of his, you know, junior ministers. We've already heard about the Home Secretary. There are kind of a whole series of things where there are breaches on the face of it of the rules, and nothing seems to happen, you know, and a falling out between the government and those who are supposed to be independently applying those rules. But the most important thing of all is the way in which they're going to try to undermine judicial review, which is when the courts can hold government to account. Our democratic system has a series of checks and balances, but at the moment we have a government to whom they feel that the law just doesn't seem to apply to them. Okay. And it's a series, it's a pattern of behaviour.
Paul, do you want to answer the question put by the man in the sweater there? Why decide to try and change the process? Now, of course, now you aren't able to change it, or the government has changed its mind. This process has been in existence since 2013, I think. So what made you decide yesterday that the moment had come?
Answer that directly. I mean, essentially, the system hasn't really carried a lot of confidence with it by complainants and people going through the system itself. But there were issues that were particularly highlighted by this case. And so rather than changing the system drastically, rather than seeking to overturn the decision, as some people have talked about, it was looking to add an extra layer of appeal to be able to sort of test the...
Yes, but why now? The question is why now?
Well, because of what we've seen, actually, politicians, when politicians go through these processes, they have a massive height to fall from. And we've seen what's happened with the human cost, as Tim said, of Owen, you know, who broke his back. He was lucky to be able to walk again, then went through this process, then lost his wife. But the perspective that is looked on in politicians, I don't think actually is often worked through. At what cost they're doing some parts of their job. But clearly there was a case to be answered. That's what I'm saying. So it wasn't going to overturn the decision, but it was going to analyse it further and give him another route of appeal.
I'm going to move on a minute, Caroline, but you've been itching to get back in.
Well, only simply to say that, you know, there may well be an argument to look again at this process, but the idea that you would do that under a live case is just unacceptable. And I sat on the committee that Andrea Leadsom chaired, looking at the issue of sexual harassment in Parliament and what kind of new processes you would need for that. And it took us about a year of very painstaking cross-party work to come up with a new system, a better system. And that's the kind of legwork you need to put in. The idea that Jacob Rees-Mogg could just rock up in Parliament yesterday and say, here's a new committee when we're putting the Tories in the driving seat of it was just not ever going to work. So we absolutely need that long-term process to get the better rules in place. And the last thing I just wanted to say to Tim was, you know, he's made a case for this being about Boris Johnson showing decency towards Owen Patterson. I mean, I think there's a school of thought that suggests that actually Boris Johnson was also thinking about his own skin about this, because he knows that the Commissioner is likely to be looking at him very soon again, this time for his flat. She's already found him, her conclusion that he was wrong over the paying for the holiday in Mystique. So he's actually got bad blood with this Commissioner. And for him to be basically promoting a process that would then see her be pushed out of her role in order for him to be able to carry on with his lackadaisical business as usual, I think is a pretty grim.
You throw this around, actually.
Very briefly, Paul,
if you throw these sort of things around, all you're actually doing is damaging politics as a whole. This is
no,
something
it's the behaviour. You are damaging the politicians.
Absolutely, it is. We've seen it time and time again. When people will obviously use this for party political points and
You're doing
and
a good job yourself.
And it will actually damage politics as a whole.
Laughing when you say that.
But
what do you feel about
because
that?
the lady at the back was talking about the narrative. She's read the case and then she's talking about the narrative, and that is the narrative that's given by the other parties, by the media, who are looking at the short term.
Are you surprised?
The short term aspect.
Are you really
the short term aspect. What we're trying to do.
You want us to hear this story. This is your story as well, isn't it? isn't it?
What we're trying
that this man needs to be let off.
So no, absolutely, because I said that it wasn't going to overturn the decision. What it was going to do.
Then why not let it run through? If it's not going to overturn the decision, let it run through.
There was nowhere else to go. What it was doing, it was taking a long-term view of, first of all, his career, and also that process to give confidence in the process long-term.
OK. I'm going to... Forgive me for interrupting. I'm going to move on simply because there is another massive topic that I want to cover this evening. Before I get to it, I just want to say that next week we will be in Hartlepool as COP26 draws to a close. On the panel we'll have Canadian filmmaker and social activist Naomi Klein. She will be there. And the following week we are in Beckenham, where we will be joined by the psychologist and author Jordan Peterson. So if you'd like to be in either two of those audiences, we have people here in person, as you can see, and here. Do apply on the Question Time website. And do come along. We'd love to see you there. Right, let's take our next question from Jonathan Rumsey.
Right. Without the likes of Russia, India and China on board, are this week's COP26 breakthrough pledges, such as the reduction of methane emissions, really a glimmer of hope, or just more blah, blah, blah?
To quote the words of Greta Thunberg. Paul Polman, I'm going to come to you first on this. Not only have you been head of Unilever for 10 years, but I know that you work with the UN as an advocate for sustainability. So what's your perspective on this?
So first, I'm glad we're talking climate change now and that I'm in Glasgow and not in London, because the issues in London seem to be more trivial than what we're dealing with here in Glasgow. I think people have discovered the burning issue of climate change and that we don't have any time anymore. And the question is a pertinent one. We need the bigger countries like India, China, Russia, 100% on board. But the situation is actually a little bit better than the question would suggest. Before COVID started, we were all worried that nobody was serious to stick to the Paris agreements to get to the 1.5 degrees. When COVID came, everybody thought that's a major distraction. We will not spend time on climate change. At the time of COVID, 20% of the world had agreed to be net zero by 2050. We now have 80% of the world. China, India, Russia have signed up to the 1.5 degree pledge. They're participating in the 100 million financing for emerging markets. They've just signed major declarations on forest reduction and forest restoration, if you want to.
But Paul,
So
let me ask you about the deforestation, Paul. Paul, I'm sorry to interrupt, but let me ask you about that deforestation, because you have 110 countries, as you say, agreeing to reverse deforestation by 2030. And then today, Indonesia, who I think had signed up to that, said, oh, hang on a minute. No, we don't want to be doing that after all. We don't think that's fair. So that must be disheartening, to say the least.
Because... No, that is not. I just want to finish. India has made a commitment to be net zero by 2070 and on carbon emission by 2050. Russia has made a commitment with China to be net zero by 2060. So these countries are there. They have made commitments. And there are mechanisms that increasingly are put in place to hold everybody accountable. This is the next step that needs to happen. So we can all speculate on the future of what these countries are doing. But as I said, they're the most affected by climate change. They also have the most interest to ensure that the right actions will be implemented. Coming to Indonesia very quickly, Indonesia is the only country with tropical forests that in the last 4 years, with their moratorium on deforestation, has actually seen a rapid decline in deforestation. And they're continuing that. They've put a price of carbon in place. They have very aggressive government policies to continue in that direction, because they simply know the world doesn't want unsustainable palm oil anymore. They know that they are destroying livelihoods of indigenous people if they would continue like that. Okay. So the country is actively involved in preserving our natural capital. In fact, Indonesia is probably best placed in the future in this world to monetize the enormous natural capital that they have, to convert their economy to this greener, more sustainable economy.
Okay. Well, let me bring in the rest of the... Oh, I'm so sorry, Paul. Forgive me. I'm just going to bring in the rest of the panel. So, Tim, the question is, you know, given that Russia, India, and China didn't turn up, how successful are this week's the breakthrough pledges at COP26? Yeah. A glimmer of hope, or more blah blah blah?
They didn't not turn up. They didn't lend their...
the leaders
The leaders didn't lend their political support, but I think there's an important distinction there. I'm actually feeling quite positive. Excuse me, I've got a cold. I'm feeling a bit positive about COP, actually. I think what it's done is it's come up with some deadlines and some goals, which might be a little bit disappointing. But the point is that they push the world in a certain direction. And once, most critically, we begin to invest, particularly private capital in the technology, that direction will develop momentum. So just because a country, because its target isn't ambitious or it's a long way off, it does matter, of course. It'd be better if it was sooner. But because they've set that target, they're going to develop towards it. But we run into two problems. One is that the developing world is not going to wish to give up growth that the developed world has enjoyed. So we've got to find some way of handling that. And an example is the disappointing statement by Indonesia on deforestation, where it said it would be unfair to expect us to keep to these limits. Why should that country, when rich countries have developed so fast, why should they have to limit themselves in order to meet our idealistic ambitions? So it may be that the West has to spend quite a bit more money to assist those countries to go to net zero. The second problem we come up against is internal, and it's to do with the cost for us at home of going green. And it was notable that Joe Biden is trying to persuade OPEC to increase production of oil. I mean, that's really not a good look. And the reality is that there is currently a gulf, a gap between our ambition of where we want to be in Britain and where the technology is. It's not quite there yet. It hasn't quite been developed. It's not quite cheap enough. So how do we meet that gap between our ambition and where the technology is? And the reality, I suspect, is a reduction in individual consumption and also spending a lot more money through taxes, subsidies, increased prices, etc., etc. So I'm waiting for the moment when Western governments are a little bit more honest with their publics and say to them, look, if you really want to do this, we can do it, and we're making progress, but it's going to cost the consumer a lot of money, and it's going to require a change in lifestyle. And when you put that proposition to the public, then you might start to see some consumer resistance.
All right. Yes, the man there in the orange
t-shirt. Good evening. The cost to the consumer, the general public, but what about the actual politicians that are attending this conference? They're flying from all over the world. The American president landed in Air Force One. He had many limousines to take him to the actual conference. How is that helping climate change?
It doesn't, and it's disgusting, and the conference should have been as virtual as possible.
Why could it exactly?
It's preposterous, and this is my point about the consumer. This is just to finish my point.
Why is it
Politicians are going to ask us to make very significant sacrifices in the next few years. And if they are still flying to a climate conference, by the way, in the middle of a pandemic, that looks absolutely appalling. And I guess that fish got to swim and the rich got to fly. But if they are going to try to persuade us, the ordinary people, to adjust our lifestyles to meet their ambitions, it's about time they started to do it as well.
The man at the back there.
With all the restrictions in 2020 that were put on us by the pandemic, carbon emissions globally fell by just over 5%. Are we kidding ourselves about the seismic shift that's needed to really reduce carbon levels down?
Well, in effectively, what we'd all have to go into some kind of lockdown for that to happen, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Caroline, I don't know what your view is about that. I mean, you're hearing Paul Polman and Tim actually both sounding pretty optimistic, and we were only part way through COP26, of course. Are you?
I mean, I think there has been some incremental steps forward, and I think in terms of trying to measure whether or not you feel optimistic, there feels like there's two kind of ways of measuring that. On the one hand, there's the kind of world of what's deemed to be currently politically possible, and in that world, yes, these small steps forward are welcome, although there are big questions about, for example, how the deforestation agreement will be properly enforced, the fact that on the finance agreement it's still not clear whether or not companies are still going to be able to fund fossil fuels, and it looks as if they are. So there are issues there. But compared to the transformative change that the science requires, and which international justice also requires, because let's not forget what's at stake here is literally the future right now of some small island states and the future of all of us very shortly too, then compared to that kind of way of measuring progress, we are still a long way off. I want to challenge some of the language around the sacrifice and so forth. Because actually, I think one of the most frustrating things about this discussion is the fact that what's possible here is the possibility of a better quality of life for all of us. It doesn't have to be around sackcloth and ashes. This is about the possibility of, for example, having every single home properly insulated, a proper house-by-house, street-by-street, local authority-led insulation programme that gets people's fuel bills down, it gets their emissions down, it creates millions of jobs. You know, one of my favourite cartoons has a professor in front of a whiteboard, and on the whiteboard they've listed all of the advantages of moving to a zero-carbon economy. So things like more local, nutritious, organic food, or kids playing in the streets again, or free or affordable public transport, properly insulated homes. And then there's a student with a speech bubble coming out of their mouth saying, but what if climate change is a hoax and we've created a better world for no reason? You know, there is a real chance here of creating that better world. And if we framed it in that way and recognised that actually public opinion is miles ahead of government, they want bolder action. Look at every single opinion poll where it's clear that people want to act. Look at the fact that climate change assemblies come up with far bolder policies than governments ever do. A frequent flyer levy, for example, which would mean that the flights, after you've taken one flight, for those people who are taking many, many flights, and let's not forget that just 15% of the population takes 70% of the flights, once you start taking more than one flight in a year, that ratchets up. So that's a fair policy that people like. They want to see a ban, for example, on high carbon products being advertised. So there is some win-wins here, and we should be really being able to talk about those and bringing people with us.
All right, well, let's hear from some of these people who might be getting the win-wins. Yes, in the black top, you with the glasses.
While personal responsibility is important, where's the emphasis being placed on corporate responsibility, who create the most emissions?
All right, I'll come back to that. Yes, the woman in the yellow top.
Given that China and Russia aren't democracies, how significant is that in terms of the people in that country in creating change?
OK, and the man in the white shirt with the blue jacket.
So one of the issues I have is that the politicians are making these pledges. They're not backed by anything. They're just weak promises. And the problem I think we have is that a lot of the leaders are using this as a photo opportunity. The Chancellor, for example, brings forward a green budget box. A few weeks ago, in his budget box, which was a different colour, he was cutting the tax that people pay for domestic flights. Yeah. Domestic flights is the worst possible way that you can move around. It just doesn't join up with the pledges that they're making now.
Paul Scully.
So COP is, and our presidency of COP is not a moment in time. It's been a long time getting to this culmination, and what we've started, as Philip said, when we took over the presidency, there was about 20 or 30% of countries, or 20 countries rather, that had adopted a net zero plan. They're now up to 90, and so we're starting to build up that crescendo, because we know that Paris was the time to set those sort of targets, but now is the time where we're actually really starting to outline what action is going to be taken. And I agree that it's, you know, again, the optics of people flying into Glasgow is not particularly good, but what you do find... And
the Prime Minister flying in a private jet down to a dinner in London, do those optics look good?
What you do find with people coming together in person is not so much what's happening in that hall, in that conference centre, it's what's happening with the negotiating teams alongside those informal meetings. And that's what, when China are not here, for example, there is a high-level negotiating team from China that's over here.
So do you think the question is it going to be a success, or is it going to be more blah blah blah? I know we're only part way through it. At the moment, is it looking like a success?
I think like Tim and Paul were saying, I'm optimistic. There's plenty more to be done. Clearly, there's plenty more to be done. The Prime Minister talked about looking at coal, cars, cash, and trees. All of those sort of things need to be looked at. Whether it's deforestation, whether it's making sure that we've got 450 of the top financial service companies in the world that are aligning their funds, trillions of pounds, dollars worth of funds, along with the climate change, the UN climate change targets. So this is a really important market change. But what it's also doing is developing and creating markets, because Tim talked about the cost to the consumer. But the government money and the government strategies that we have also leverages private money. So the hydrogen strategy, for example, is already bringing in money to this country because they know that government are backing a particular technology, and that can start to be developed.
Emily?
I think in order to assess whether COP's going to be a success, I think what we need to do is we need to look at, are the commitments that the countries are making enough? And will they stick to them? As the gentleman in the blue jacket was saying, I mean, I agree with you, because I do worry that sometimes, well, we saw it, frankly. I went to the Copenhagen summit, and there was £100 billion that was supposed to be being committed by the developed world to the developing world to help them to develop in a green way and to be able to protect themselves against the effects of climate change. Still haven't even seen that money. So I do worry that there's countries there going, oh, we'll be zero by 2070. There isn't a plan, a proper plan as to how they're going to get there. You know, and it doesn't really, I mean, it's great if now people are starting to say we want to get to net zero, and that's different to what they said before, because they were saying before they didn't need to do it. But we need to have a proper plan showing how they're going to get there, what's the glide path, how much carbon are they going to produce in the meantime, because the truth is, in order to stick, to make sure that our planet doesn't heat up more than 1.5 degrees, we need to halve the amount of carbon that we're producing by the end of this decade. Now, how are we going to do that? And yes, you know, we need to have proper commitments from countries where they mean it, and where whenever we have any international meetings, we sit down and we go, right, how's your plan? How are you getting on with it? So that people are held to account properly on it. And yes, we need to also spread responsibility to other companies. It may be that British companies in Britain, or perhaps Dutch companies, you know, when they're working in places where there's a lot of regulation, where there's a good media, you know, they may be behaving in a way that they can hold their heads up high. But some of those companies are not behaving well once they get out of Europe and away from the media, and where there are governments who can't regulate or don't regulate, or you know, whatever it is, and those companies in those countries are behaving in a completely irresponsible way. Okay. What we need to do is be looking carefully at our supply chains and regulating them properly and have a proper vision down them, so that we can keep some control over the way that some companies are behaving around the world.
Well, Paul Polman, let me come back to you then. I mean, you're not head of Unilever anymore, but I know you've talked a lot about corporate responsibility. What's your view on what Emily's just said about some companies not living up to their responsibilities?
No, I agree. I mean, we're all in this together, and we're talking about the future of mankind. And the Secretary General called it Code Red. Yeah. I think what we now see, and I want to repeat that, we have 90% of the countries making net zero commitments. We have half of the world's capital making net zero commitments. So we can all have a long discussion if these commitments are serious or not. But we've agreed on a review of that now every 2 years. The emerging markets are asking for an annual review. I happen to agree with that. There are clear gates and dates being put in place to see if we can hold the people accountable to their commitments. If we don't do that, obviously we have a serious problem. But the issue is this: even with our current commitments that we make, we are still far removed from what we really need to stay below 1.5 degrees. We need to go 7 times more on wind or solar, 20 times more on electric cars. We're talking here about the biggest transformation of our global economy since the Industrial Revolution, which started here in Glasgow, by the way. Now, coming to the cost, I think for the first time, people are starting to realize that the cost of not acting now is infinitely higher than the cost of acting. COVID has shown us that we can't have healthy people on an unhealthy planet. We have spent just in Europe and the US alone $16 trillion to save lives and livelihoods. The IMF estimates that we've lost $27 trillion in the global economy. And guess what? Most of that cost is borne by the people that already get the wrong stick of society, in losing their jobs, in losing their lives, in not having a safety net around them. So governments are starting to understand, and businesses are starting to understand, that this is probably the biggest and best business opportunity that we have in front of us. And what we see now for a change is that we have enough responsible businesses coming up that are making the net zero pledges, are starting to implement it, and in fact are the ones that are pushing the governments now to the higher ambitions that we absolutely need. Okay. And ultimately the proof of the pudding is in the eating, but many people will be watching. This is not something that are just empty words anymore. It's too late for that. I have children, I have grandchildren. That's why I'm here.
Okay, well, listen, we've got another question on this, sort of related to this subject. Let's hear it from Martin. Martin Korb. Where are you, Martin? Ah, there you go. Right, let's get a microphone to you.
How can people afford to be able to change to heat pump systems and electric cars, given the cost of these things?
So this comes right to the heart of this, which is what you were talking about, Tim, and Caroline, you were talking about. Well, Paul Scully, let's start with you, given that the government has made proposals on this. How can people afford to do this?
Well, obviously, let's take heat pumps first of all. There's, you know, the £5,000 subsidy grant towards putting them in, but you don't have to put them in now. This is as you Emily described it, a glide path to 2050. It's when you're replacing your boiler. We're not trying to get to net zero tomorrow. And that's what I meant about driving markets, driving technology. If you look at solar power, when we first...
Well, hang on, just sticking... I'm sorry, Paul, just sticking to heat pumps for me, because that was the question. So the cost of a heat pump is about, what, £7,000 to £10,000? Yeah. The subsidy from the government is £5,000. Is that enough for you, Martin, to persuade you to put in a heat pump?
But I'm not asking to put it in tomorrow. That's what I'm saying. I'm not asking...
So you're saying they're going to get cheaper?
Solar power, when we first introduced it, compared to where we are now, it's gone down by 89%. And that's because of the technology. That's because of you start a market, you show businesses that actually government are backing this kind of technology. Businesses then have the confidence that for the next 10, 20 years, they can actually pile in, invest money. The net zero strategy that we launched 2 weeks ago is seeking to leverage £90 billion worth of private money into developing all of these kind of technologies and creating new markets, which incidentally will create jobs. And as Paul said, actually, there's a business opportunity there. So that's when you get that that perfect landing point, when you can actually have, instead of the kind of businesses that Emily was talking about exploiting people, can actually exploit opportunities for good, for the common good.
Well, so how can people afford to change heat pumps and electric cars given the cost of these things? That's the question. And that's what we're all going to have to do.
And I think it's a completely limp response. I think it's completely inadequate. Yes, of course, people need to be able to change. Most of us heat our homes through gas, but also most of us don't have sufficient insulation. So it's all very well getting a heat pump, but all the heat is going out the window anyway. So we need to have both. We need to make sure that the homes are properly insulated. We need to make sure that we change the way in which we heat our homes. And, you know, quite frankly, I think that it is a huge shame that, you know, over the last 10, 12 years that there has been a change in a policy. When I was in the Department for Energy and Climate Change as a bag carrier, we had a policy of trying to make sure that we insulated homes up and down the country. The government cut that scheme. They introduced another one, which frankly has just been pathetic. And we've also had nearly 1 million homes built in the last few years that haven't been properly insulated and will need to be, you know, retrofitted. When, if we'd had the proper regulations in the first place, at least the new homes would be warm. So we need to be putting much more into heat pumps. Of course we do, in order to make sure that people can have them. We need to regulate the new homes to make sure that they're built properly. We need to put the money into insulation. It's not very sexy talking about insulating your loft, you know, but that is the sort of things that people need to be able to do. And how will anybody, even if they can afford an electric car, what's the point if you can't charge it? You know, because there aren't any charges up and down the country. People don't want to go halfway up a motorway and run out of electricity. You know, this is not, it just doesn't work. They're not putting the money into the infrastructure. They're all talk and they're not doing it sufficiently seriously.
The woman at the back. Yes.
I think a lot of this, again, comes back to the cost of the person. So being in Eastleigh, we're very close to both an airport and a station, which have got fantastic kind of ability to get everywhere. But if I was to want to go to Edinburgh, for say, I could get there for about £30 on a flight. Yeah. And if I was to get the train, it would be well over 100. And I think, again, I have a want and a drive to be green, but actually that choice is taken away from me. And in the same as I would love to have an electric car, but I live in a terraced house. How could I put the charger across the pavement? How could I afford to have a car? I think, again, it's that choice gets taken away when the cost is so high.
Man here in the front.
Emily, you stole my thunder.
I'm sorry, love.
A friend of mine has an electric car and suffers very regular with juice anxiety.
Juice anxiety.
Oh,
you said we didn't want to talk about anything sexy. And then talk about juice anxiety. Really, I've never.
You thought of that? I didn't even cross my mind.
Expression before.
Juice anxiety is a thing.
And it's not getting any better. Saying it twice.
But he drives around, and I've had a late night call saying, "Can I come to your house and charge my car on the plug because I may not be able to get back home?" The charging unit units are out of order. There might be somebody sat in the charging unit charging their car and having a lovely coffee, and he's waiting. So I don't think in this area there's enough chargers. And I would love an electric car, but I don't want to suffer right now with juice anxiety.
Tim?
Well, especially if you had to, for instance, take someone to hospital or in an emergency go a very long distance. This comes back to my point about the gap between the ambitions and where the technology actually is and its affordability. I'd add to that, in the case of electric cars, even if we all tomorrow ran out and bought one, which we couldn't afford to do, how would we charge them? We'd run it off the grid. And if we all switch from using petrol to electrification, well, that's going to require extra fuel, isn't it? And where's that going to come from? Well, presumably we'd end up burning fossil fuels all over again. So the infrastructure also has to catch up in order to match our ambitions. I'm not saying it can't be done, because the point is that in the long run, as has been said, you build a market for something so that eventually, in theory, green technology could actually end up guaranteeing us not just abundant energy, but also cheaper energy that's cleaner and actually cheaper than fossil fuels because it's on tap and it's renewable. So in the long run, it'll be great. But in the short term, there is a cost, and it's going to be borne by the consumer. And I'd remind people that over the summer, before we even put our heating on, many people's, my electricity bill almost doubled. That's the kind of cost that's going to get passed on to the consumers. So how do we bridge that gap? Is it a reduction in consumption? Here's an idea. Let's ban private jets.
Caroline?
Well, I agree with Tim about enough money. I don't agree with much more that Tim said, in the sense that there are political choices about where you put the cost for this transition. And clearly, you do not put that cost on people who are unable to pay it. So when you go back to the discussion about the insulating your home or putting the heat pumps in your home, what the government should have put in that heat and building strategy was far more upfront government money. Government can borrow pretty cheaply right now, and it needs to invest upfront in order to be able to reap the rewards afterwards. Someone mentioned COVID, quite right. If you look at how much we've spent on, the government has spent on paying people to be on furlough and so forth, it's about 100 billion a year. That has basically put the economy on ice, but it hasn't actually achieved anything very positive beyond making sure that people could keep going. If we put that money, that kind of money, into the transition to a green economy, it would create many, many jobs. It would begin to pay for itself as those jobs raise the taxes that go back to the Treasury. And we can do this. I think what's so frustrating is, look at some of the countries in Europe who are already working out mass transit, public transport schemes. We should have a vision that isn't just simply looking at petrol cars and thinking, how do we replace all of those with electric cars? Because the building of cars itself is quite energy intensive. What we need to do is to have more imagination around public transport schemes. The person at the back there was saying that she would love to be able to use the train, but it's much more expensive than flying. That is a policy choice the government has made, and it could make a different choice. It could, for example, tax the fuel on aviation domestically, and it could make train a lot more affordable. So we know how to do this stuff. What we need is a Prime Minister who isn't giving a green light to the Cambo oil field, who isn't giving the green light to a Cumbrian coal mine, that isn't planning £27 billion on the biggest road building plan ever, but is serious about investing in the green economy.
Paul Polman. Paul Polman, I saw you listening and putting your thumbs up there. Let's hear from you.
No, actually, I agree with most of this. In 2014, the International Energy Agency was saying that the electric vehicles would be at the same cost as the combustion engine by 2050. We're getting to that in 2025, 24, 25. 60% of the energy can now be done green at a cheaper cost than the fossil fuel, if we just put the right policies in place. In the world, we still have $500 billion of perverse subsidies against fossil fuel. Many governments have put rescue packages in place behind COVID that put more money to the fossil economy than to the green economy. It doesn't have to cost more money. That is just a fallacy. And by the way, when we invented the light bulb, it didn't work right away either. When we invented the computer, it didn't last either more than 1 minute, and then you had to recharge them again. We are well beyond that. We are well beyond that. Now coming to the people itself. everything we do is not because of climate change. It is to ensure that everybody can have a decent life. We're doing this for inclusion. We're doing this for climate justice. We're doing this for equity and respect. So when we put a policy in place, like carbon pricing, which is absolutely needed, we should put that money that we get from carbon pricing and be sure that the people that haven't seen their incomes move up in the last 3 or 4 decades don't have to pay a penny more, but actually are better off, so that we don't have the gilets jaunes or the yellow jackets in the street. If the governments look at it holistically versus the silos in which we operate, 90 or 100% of these issues can be solved. And it's the same for business, by the way. We should stop competing with each other on the future of humanity, including in politics. And we should start working together like adults on these things for the benefit of mankind. We have the technology, we know what we need to do, and we don't have time.
OK, Paul, thank you. I'm going to move on. We could obviously talk about climate change all evening. It's a massive topic and hugely important. There's another question that lots of you submitted this evening, so I'm just picking one of them from Tracy. Tracy Graham.
Can a racist term ever be defined as banter?
Right, so obviously what you're talking about here is the furore there's been over the ex-Yorkshire cricketer Azeem Rafiq, who claims he was subjected to international racism at his club. Institutional racism at his club. And he clearly feels that this has not been handled properly, and Yorkshire has carried out its own investigation, ruled that no disciplinary action would take place, and that has basically called it banter, as you say. Tim?
Oh, the answer's no.
Simple as that.
It's as simple as that. I don't see what more there is to say, and I don't see how the club can possibly explain its decision to not take further action. Other than, well, I suppose, hypothetically, perhaps there was a reluctance to do something that might damage the career of a star player. I don't know. But that's purely speculative. But no, that particular term is totally unacceptable.
Shall we just, I'm just going to explain what the term is in case, and I certainly do not mean to cause any offence. It's, what Rafiq is talking about is the P word, and in case that's not clear to anybody, it's spelled P-A-K-I, and clearly he found it hugely offensive, and this is a term that we understand was deemed as
It is hugely offensive, and crucially, it was always hugely offensive. And sometimes when people use the banter defence, what they mean is, well, I saw it used on a 70s sitcom, and people used to say it all the time, and I just haven't caught up and I didn't know. Actually, almost all of that sort of language was considered offensive at the time, because it was offensive, because it is derogatory. There's really no possible explanation for it. And I'm not just astonished that the language is being used, I'm astonished that such an august institution like that, so critical to English sport, would behave in such a shamefully appalling way. And the simple answer to your question was no.
Emily?
No, never.
But I don't think I have a great deal more to add, apart from perhaps this, which is British kids whose heritage is from the South Asia are very often really, really keen on cricket, perhaps more keen sometimes. You know, you see loads of kids of Asian heritage playing cricket, and for a cricket club that is hoping to be, you know, as good as it possibly can be, to alienate huge amounts of talent like that because of racism, it's alienating those youngsters who should be embraced by the club, just because that's the right thing to do. But also the club is doing itself a grave injustice because they're not getting these talented kids in, because they're being alienated. So they're doing no good. Just to kind of override talent by racism is never going to help anyone.
And Paul Scully, looking in the cold light of day, and this investigation started quite some time ago, that the findings have yet to be revealed in full. It does, on the face of it, judging from the reaction we're getting here, the reaction of the audience, seem baffling. What do you think is going on here?
To be honest, I couldn't tell you. I mean, I'm someone of South Asian heritage. My father was Burmese. And I actually, although I'm comparatively pale skin, I had exactly those words thrown at me at school.
How did that feel to you?
I shrugged it off as banter, and it was something that was just there. And I must admit, I'm saying this not as someone that's had it anywhere near as badly as Azim Rafiq or other people growing up.
Did you think it was banter at the time? I mean, did you really
be honest,
think
I didn't really. It was as I was getting older that I sensed it more, because actually what you're finding is that, you know, to Tim's point, that it was always wrong.
Yeah.
It's thrown around. I mean, to suit people of that colour, of a dark coloured skin, whether they're and in the 70s, for example, Bangladesh, a Bangladeshi, being called that now, they've just gone through a civil war.
I know.
You know, you know, with these other countries, and dividing it in that way is terrible. So come forward now. No, it's absolutely not right. It cannot be called banter. It must be called out, and we must do more to make sure that we're calling out. I'm glad some action is being taken now to one of the people that's not going to be selected for England anytime soon, and obviously they're not going to be hosting England matches. I think it's something that we do really need to do more on.
And Paul Polman, you know, you don't live here. I don't necessarily expect you to be up to speed with the exact detail of this case, but I'm just thinking in terms of your role as head of Unilever, it's a massive multinational company. This must be an issue that you have also dealt with.
Yeah, I got it. You don't need to live in the UK or anywhere. This is a global issue. My daughter-in-law, who lives in the UK, is from Singapore, and she has to deal with this every week. She's a lawyer in London, and it's totally intolerable. And she deals with it, but there is an underlying issue that goes much deeper, that I think is in every culture coming up, where hate is being spread, where social media doesn't work in our favor. And we have to fight that. And if we stay silent, we become complicit. In the US, we've been very strong in rallying the CEOs together to step up when democracy was undermined in January 6, or when a president makes racial remarks like in Charlottesville, or when there are laws being passed that discriminate against the LGBT community. If we don't speak up against this populist or xenophobics or nationalists or people that have these type of opinions that undermine the basic values of humanity, we move the boundaries in a very dangerous way. Yeah. And if you are a CEO of a company or in any position of power, society actually expects you to speak up. And this is difficult for some people. They tend to take the safe route or the easy way out, or to keep silent. That's not acceptable, in my opinion, when it gets to these fundamental issues of dignity and respect, equity, compassion, that really are at the roots of making humanity function.
Okay. Caroline.
Well, Paul just put it absolutely beautifully, and I've got little to add. I think that issue of complicity is a really important one, because, you know, sometimes you kind of think, what difference can I make when this is going on? And standing up and speaking out and speaking truth and not being complicit is something we can all do, whether it's something we're overhearing on a train or if it's happening in a sports place or anywhere else. So I think there is a responsibility on all of us. I do find the whole way in which Yorkshire Cricket Club handled this quite extraordinary, and adding insult to injury really by just kind of dismissing it so, you know, as if it's not a big deal. And I just wanted to give a shout out to the campaign from Hope Not Hate, which is a brilliant organisation here in the UK that is absolutely standing up for this and is running a campaign right now around getting racism out of sport, out of British life altogether.
Okay. Well, I'm afraid our time is up. I can see quite a few with your hands up. Forgive me that I'm not able to come to you because our hour is over. Thank you very much to the panel for coming this evening. Paul Polman, thank you very much for joining us from Glasgow. Thank you to the audience here in Eastleigh, and of course, thank you to you at home for watching from Question Time. Bye-bye.